How many of you feel that you have a working knowledge of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights? Put your hands in the air. Okay. How many of you think you have a very, very small knowledge of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights? How many of you have never heard of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights? Okay. So I would say there's about half the audience that have a good working knowledge, and then about another quarter that have a sort of a bit of a knowledge. So you might want to, when we talk, you might want to go back into that. But what's it about, Dan? I mean, is this human rights, business and human rights, just the latest fashion in sustainability? Or are we shifting the debate completely in governance terms? Is this a new discussion that needs to conform to different rules, or can you just plug in and play some of the human rights stuff, Dan?
Well, I hope is a significant change in the world, and I hope is not something just a short-term fashion. I hope is something to stay. I think that the uptake, at least in the political recognition of the guiding principles, and the fact that it's not being disputed as the authoritative framework regarding human rights by no government or no business association is a very significant foundation, and so my hope is that it's going to stay for long, and since has been plugged in other frameworks like the Agenda 2030 or the Global Goals Agenda, where it's plugged in the OECD guidelines, and it's plugged in now since April on Robeco-SAM for all the companies that are being analyzed, and we see and we go on, and it's being plugged in and it's being referenced all over. But beyond the reference, we don't see enough uptake really in practice. Because if you go into the documents and the frameworks that are around, they reference the guiding principles, but then they don't have not even a footnote to say, and now what, and the know-how. So we are right now struggling in the know-how. And just 2 weeks ago at the GRI conference in Amsterdam, there was a research presented considering almost 500 companies that say that human rights is a material issue, that have a report based on G4, and out of those 476, only one said that their human rights policy, practices, implementation, follow-up, etc., is fully aligned to the guiding principles. 1 out of 476. And so that talks about, let's say, the half empty and half full half of the glass. The half full is not being disputed, is accepted, is all over, is plug in, is reference. On the half empty, we have a very long way to go in terms of the practical use of the principles and the integration into the policies and practices of companies. But I will add to that that the largest resistance today is not from large business associations, it comes mostly from governments. So the governments that appointed me and the governments that unanimously endorse the guiding principles are really not showing enough leadership and commitment to get the guiding principles on board. Through public policy, on state-owned enterprises, providing a smart mix of regulation and incentives, all that, despite some countries in Central North of Europe, is more or less lacking badly. And if you look around the world, and I'm coming now from Korea, Korea is more or less okay, but so we have a mixed picture, let's say.
So this is curious, of course. Governments create your mandate, they vote for you to go on this working group, and yet you're saying that many of them don't really mean it. They don't really take it seriously. Yep. Unpick that a little bit, because many of the members here will be sourcing from those countries. Are we talking about Asian governments? I mean, be frank.
Latin Americans,
Latin
where
American
I'm from. Yeah.
So this is just a game, it's lip service, they're ticking a box, or is it for other reasons?
Well, I'll say that it's, again, a mixed picture. There are some governments that lack the capacity, right. So they are invited to join a declaration that looks okay, that they don't have the competencies to really engage in the definition of the context, the writing of it, and so they basically sign by default. And that's, I'll say, about half of the countries. Yeah. So, and then there is the complete disconnection between the diplomatic setting in Geneva and the negotiation that takes place there, and the capacity to translate that into something practical. So when you talk on the ground with the same governments that signed the agreements, they had no idea what we're talking about. And there's disconnection. I'll say that's about half. And on the other half, I'll say the 25% are trying to do their best. Some are doing much better job than others, but there's, let's say, genuine interest. And then there's another 25% that I'll say are pushing back for different reasons.
It's one of the reasons that labour cost is actually a competitive issue.
Well, some countries sell their country as a cheap labor country, which is, I find it can be completely wrong, let's say, and fundamentally wrong. But there are also other factors. The guiding principles on Principle 456 reference or refers to the state as an economic actor, which includes state-owned enterprises with high level of corruption, inefficiency, nepotism, lack of transparency. Then the state as an economic actor on procurement, for example, a lot of corruption going on again, a lack of transparency, a lack of accountability. The state also manages pension funds, for foreign sovereign wealth funds, etc. So the state is a very powerful actor. In fact, it's the #1 economic actor almost anywhere in the world. And you sense when you're talking with some people in the government and with some of these governments who say, we will really like to push this forward, but don't touch the state-owned enterprises, or don't get into transparency on procurement. But I said, well, but procurement, you have 200,000 SMEs connected with you, so you have the largest supply chain in your country. Why is not that possible? Well, check the list of the top 100 suppliers of the government and compare the last names with the Congress. And it will match perfectly.
Maybe they just have very similar names.
Well, can be, yeah. Some countries,
in my country or something.
I'm Gonzalez, so it's a very popular last name. So then there's pushback there. And then not all business are decent people, are ethical people. Not all business leaders are positive leaders. And actually corruption hurts the vast majority, but benefits a few a lot. And the lack of transparency is bad overall for society, but very good for some few. And those few are very often powerful.
Okay, so that's the problem. All right?
I think so.
And you're being very open about the problem, and I think quite a few people in the audience would probably identify with the problem. How do we solve it?
Well, we're trying to add more accountability, and transparency and accountability is always welcome. We're trying to build up platforms for accountability to make governments more accountable to their commitments. Also business, but that's happening more or less driven by the market. The non-financial risk analysts are asking more and more about social impacts and human rights, and reference more and more the guiding principles. It's also happening through sustainability reporting, and the report will explain mechanisms in many stock exchanges and different locations in the world. All that are very positive trends, and I think it adds much needed transparency and for the society to challenge our business people and to say and to see up to what point you're true to your commitment. So check your policy commitment. If it is based on due diligence, what it comes out of it and what are you actually delivering, and to be open to be challenged by your stakeholders. That side, not being perfect, is moving better. But outside of Europe, and where you have the European Commission, in which adds this capacity to facilitate peer learning among countries and public policy setters, we don't have that out of Europe. So if you go to Eastern Europe, Africa, my Latin American region, the platforms to make our own governments accountable to their own commitments is so weak that it's almost inexistent. So basically, if a government doesn't have any intention to fulfill any of the commitments or the treaties or implement anything, it can get away with it.
So, I mean, yesterday I mentioned I was in Pakistan last week for this Asian living wage apparel meeting with 9 Asian countries. And the question came up a lot, why was the Pakistani government hosting this discussion? And then, of course, GSP Plus was put on the table. And I wonder if Pakistan would have even hosted the meeting if GSP Plus didn't exist. So are we looking at a world still where it's European leverage that is maintaining this conversation? Leverage from European governments, leverage from European companies, to some extent leverage from European investors, and perhaps one day European consumers. I mean, that's a bit depressing for me, because in 2011, I thought in 2016, we would observe a logic system where Asian governments, Asian companies were buying into this directly for their own reasons.
There is.
I think that's I see that happening some places.
Yes.
But
There is some hope. So I'll say half of what's going on today is what you just described as Europeans using their leverage. Yes. And it's something that whoever is from Europe here should be proud about that, because you're doing a good job in pushing this agenda globally. But the world goes a lot beyond Europe, and we need everyone on board, and not only the Europeans. And also, I'm from Latin America. It's always a very good excuse to blame the Europeans, to say, well, these guys are ahead of the curve, it's another culture, so it's nice, but it's not doable here. I do not accept that as something it's not acceptable, because I don't think that we have, let's say, genetically, we don't have any genetic impediment to be competitive and to be responsible and to be ethical. So I think it's a very bad excuse, but it's an excuse that more or less you can get away with. But on the positive side, there are some things happening in some locations, and I was recently in some Asian countries, not only Korea, where they were telling me that CSR overall, which is starting to include human rights in, let's say, in the picture, but it's still more or less, let's say, CSR, which includes human rights, yeah, but it's not human rights openly. They say is very market driven. We're having difficulties to access markets that are middle, upper class, or middle income, high income countries. We're being asked by our clients on social, environmental, ESG, traceability, and we know we don't perform that well. So when we're being asked, we know that if we tell the absolute truth, we might get out of the supply chain, or that given supply chain, so we better lie. Yeah, but so that's a matter of how you fix that. But it's very clear that the clients have a very important role to play, and that push coming from the market is positive. The other thing is that many countries, developing countries, have large business now that are becoming investors overseas. And so it's not only big European headquarter companies, and actually the fastest growing ones in the world are almost all of them based in the developing world. And many of them, actually almost half of them, are state-owned. It's not even private, it's the state that is pushing. But anyway, so in order to access markets, the conversations that I have been having, we have been having, is we don't only want to be accepted as a good investor in the least developed countries that are somehow hopeless and will have to accept whatever. We would like to be a player in the most developed countries, and the high-income countries, and we're really not accepted there. Yeah, people reject us, don't like us when we say a Chinese investor coming into, I don't know, Brussels. Oh no, that's the worst thing that can happen in the world. And they say, well, we want to be accepted as a decent, as a player, and that also drives a change. And then many of the countries, now that the economy is not doing that well, are struggling to attract investments.
Right.
And the investment side now has embedded more and more this idea, well, of course, human rights, but it's let's say all the ESG is getting into the investors. And as the investors are getting those criteria more structured and are sharper in how they present it to the recipient countries of investment, that is also having an impact. And then some governments are very enlightened and are doing an excellent job. And I will say, it was mentioned before, the Norwegians. The Norwegian pension fund is a great example, because they included the guiding principles explicitly. They've pushed themselves to act accordingly, and that is having a tremendous impact in some countries. They pull out from a very large company in Korea, and that has had a tremendous impact in the other Korean big companies that have European investment, because they say, well, that might happen to us next, so we better get our house in order and avoid this, let's say, huge embarrassment to have a big investor pulling out.
So just to summarize where we are then, what you're saying is there's good news and there's bad news. The bad news is the world, in terms of business and human rights, the world seems still too reliant on European leverage, I would say.
Yeah.
But the good news is that seems to be working to some extent in markets, in bilateral trade agreements, etc. We were talking about the FTA with Vietnam yesterday as well.
And the FTA with Central America, with Colombia.
Yes.
South Korea.
Colombia, yes.
It actually is working, yes.
Even the one they're rushing through on Jordan at the moment in the context of refugees. Okay, I want to get some of you guys in from the audience. I mean, we've got lots of companies here. We mentioned SEDEX, we mentioned FTA. last question to you, Dante. What's your expectation of all of these people here?
Well, I think that our expectation has been set. We have the ambition to speed up and scale up. And the ambition to speed up and scale up means move from the good intentions to practice, move from knowing on the surface of the problems and actually knowing into the deep problems and go to the root causes of problems and try to solve them. One thing that I think that this coalition against modern slavery is a quite good idea, because it's a big group of companies act together. Actually, some of the most dramatic problems of the world can be tackled, maybe not solved completely, but can be tackled. And the argument that I cannot deal, or I cannot work beyond my first, second, or third tier, that has to be part of the past. The guiding principles very clearly say the responsibility of the company follows the impacts. So if the impact and the most severe impacts happen 10 tiers away, well, you should take responsibility 10 tiers away. So there's no good argument to not know, and there's no good argument to not show. But that requires something, is to be brave. Because if you tell the truth and you say, I'm not perfect and I have a lot of problems and I'm struggling here, here, and here, it is very easy to be in the front line of papers like had happened with some large companies recently. And from our side, that brave attitude is what we need. We need leadership. We need to use the leverage you have. And we see some positive trends on that side, but still on a very slow speed. So we will call, and we want the business associations to push the membership base to deliver much more, to be way more ambitious, and to be able to say publicly, far from being perfect, we are imperfect, and we're humans actually, so by definition we're imperfect. But we know what the problems are, we're looking after proactively, and we might be embarrassed. Yes, we might be embarrassed. We didn't saw things coming, maybe. It's hard to believe it, maybe. But anyway, but now we're doing our best to try to fix this in a more systemic way, all together, and that's something that should work, and in some aspects, in some industries, is working.
We had a session here yesterday on due diligence, and the question was, where do you draw the line on adequacy? And there was some frustration after the hour and a quarter that we hadn't answered the question, because it's a very complex question, where you draw the line. I mean, how much knowledge should these companies, particularly if they're SMEs, be actively acquiring about risky things, some of which are systemic in cultures like forced labor, violence against women, child labor. You pick the rock up, you see what's underneath. Unless you know that you can do something about it, why pick the rock up in the first place?
Well, that's an expression of leadership, yeah.
That's what leadership means?
Yeah, that's what leadership means, of course.
To pick the rock up is leadership. Okay.
Absolutely.
All right.
Hi, I'm Larry Brown from Esprit. One little quote or statistic that you threw in I found very interesting. It's that 476 companies have done GRI-4 reports, and 475 of them have made no reference to the UN guiding principles. My company does a GRI-4 report, and I'll let you guess which of those two groups we're in. But in our report, we reference the BSCI standard, we reference Better Work, we reference the ILO core conventions, we reference probably 15 or 20 different standards that we try to follow. And all of these are fundamentally the same as the UN guiding principles. And so what I'm wondering is, what would you have us do differently? And how do we work the UN guiding principles into that forest of other standards that we are trying to follow in specific areas of our business?
Before you answer that, are there any others? Because we'll take one round. Otherwise, that's quite a solid question in its own right. Yes, sorry, yes, gentleman just beside you. We should call it the pass box, not the catch box.
Yeah, I'm Ahmad Ansari from SGS. Just on the realistic basis, when we are speaking of implementation of UN guiding principle, we realize that there is a biggest hurdle right now in implementation is a lack of governance. Let's call in a simple word, corruption. What basically the ideas and strategy you are really, because I think that's the core issue, I mean, if we tackle that issue, automatically the implementation of UN guiding principle will be easy process. So what basically are your approach on tackling that issue?
Okay, right. Off you go.
Okay, well, on the first question, I will clarify a little bit. The GRI presented in November last year in our forum in Geneva a report on 1,400 and so companies, and just checking on the indicators that are related with human rights explicitly, and the outcome was not very impressive. Only about 19% had a policy on human rights, despite saying that human rights is a material issue. So it was a very big inconsistency to say this is material, but I don't have a policy, an umbrella or a statement. And so what I did was ask the people from GRI, can you go a bit deeper? And they chose 3 industries in which there are companies that are members of associations that are explicitly promoting the use of the guiding principles. ICMM in the mining, IPICA in the oil and gas, and UNEP-FI. And the 3 of them, so we said, they asked us, will this make sense? Well, absolutely, because if you're from a membership organization that for the last 4 years have been saying this is very important, everyone should have it on board, you would expect them to have it on board. Yeah, and the findings were quite depressing. And actually, so I'm not saying that you're a particular company, but the finding is that you have a policy commitment about 20%, but then it's not connected with a description of operations. It doesn't say up to where it was considered, what part of your supply chain, what risks are considered, your grievance mechanisms, completely vague. So a lot of good intentions, probably yes, but beyond that, on substance, that you can say, well, this is a very solid approach, little. And the report is going to be public, and it was already presented, and the room was actually packed full, because it's quite challenging to say after so many years and members of associations that actually frame something, the delivery that is being, the story being told. So I'm not saying that they don't do anything. They say is what they tell, and what is public is quite limited. And so that's something to be, let's say, that requires more discussion. Maybe is the something like the Nestle situation, in which you confess everything and then you get very, very, very badly hammered. So and I will say that's not what we would like to see happening.
Full disclosure, you don't want to see full transparency.
We want to see it. We don't want it to be blamed for that. We want to encourage companies to be very, very transparent.
But the Nestle experience is
tough. It's tough.
I'm being told we're out of time, so just take the corruption question. Yeah.
Well, completely agree. We're trying to do our best in collaboration with many other institutions in the world. We're very happy to be part of the Global Goals Agenda. Paragraph 67 is explicit about the use of the guiding principles in the lens in which how companies should look at their role regarding the Sustainable Development Agenda is clear. It's not fully understood, I will say, but it's clear, at least it's written there. But one of the problems that we face is coherence, working in silos, inside governments, UN agencies, everyone on their own, pretty much, like in a company. The sustainability team disconnected from procurement, disconnected from strategy, disconnected from others. Yeah, so it's about the same logic. And then I fully agree with the governance thing. We're trying to find champions around the world. I'm coming from Korea. The government wants to be a regional champion, which is very promising. But we need to find champions that actually, but also the institutional infrastructure to provide the follow-up and the needed accountability. Because we can have an event once in a while and raise awareness for one day. But what happens the next day? And who does the follow-up? And how so we're trying to promote mechanisms to push races to the top in the whole world and region by region, governments to governments, business to business, industries to industries, and that is, I think, is something that is starting to happen. Of course, we have a very long way to go.
Dante, muchas gracias.
Gracias a ti.
If you're that good.